Hi, everyone. I'm going to go ahead and give it just a minute or two to go ahead and let all the attendees in. And so we will get momentarily started. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and get started, and then people can file in as they're logging in. So good evening, everyone. I want to welcome everyone to this important event and remind you that it is being recorded. The recording will be shared with you after it is captioned. My name is Danielle. I use she, her pronouns. I'm a graduate student at West Virginia University, also known as WVU, and I'm the Assistant Program Coordinator for the WVU Higher Education and Prison Initiative. I will be the moderator for this discussion this evening. And I also want to begin by acknowledging the Massawomic, Shawnee, and Osage as the First Nation owners of the land where WVU and Morgantown, West Virginia now stands. We pay the respect to their elders, their lores, customs, and creation spirits. This event is a result of a collaboration between the Appalachian Prison Book Project, the WVU Higher Education and Prison Initiative, and the LGBT Books to Prisoners project. In the chat tonight, I'll be sharing links on where you can purchase and or support the work of our panelists and our sponsors. And as attendees, you'll be able to submit any questions or concerns that you have to the panelists and myself using the Q&A tool. We have a really great panel scheduled for tonight, who I will be introducing momentarily. The panelists will be discussing the important and necessary work that they do, and also how that aligns with reimagining justice for system-impacted gender and sexual minorities. And while it is not required to be familiar with their work prior to this event, I highly recommend you do so after this. I found myself on more than one occasion getting lost in the pages of these books that were beautifully written. And we hope that our discussion tonight will provide new insights and possibilities for reimagining justice for system-impacted gender and sexual minorities. So first, let's please welcome Valena Beety, who is a professor of law at Arizona State Sandra Day O'Connor College of Law and the deputy director of the Academy for Justice, a criminal justice center connecting research with policy reform. She previously served as a law professor and the founding director of the West Virginia Innocence Project at the West Virginia University College of Law. Her experiences as a federal prosecutor in Washington, D.C., and as an innocence litigator in Mississippi and West Virginia shape her research and her writing on wrongful convictions, forensic evidence, and the opioid crisis and incarceration. She has successfully exonerated wrongfully convicted clients and obtained presidential grants of clemency for drug offenses. It is this work that she writes about in her recently released book, Manifesting Justice: Wrongfully Convicted Women Reclaim Their Rights, which she will be discussing this evening. Hugh Ryan is a writer, a historian, and a curator. Hugh regularly teaches creative nonfiction in the MFA program at SUNY Stony Brook. He currently serves on the board of advisor for the archives at the LGBT Center in Manhattan and the Stonewall National Museum and Archives in Fort Lauderdale. Hugh has been honored by the Brooklyn Historical Society and the Committee on LGBT History of American Historical Association, and the Brooklyn Borough President for Hugh's work on queer history of Brooklyn. It is his recently released book, The Women's House of Detention: A Queer History of a Forgotten Prison, that Hugh will be sharing tonight. Rayna Momen is an unapologetically Black, trans, abolitionist, poet, and queer criminologist. They are a Southern Regional Education Board State Doctoral Scholarship Program Fellow and the program coordinator for the West Virginia University Higher Education and Prison Initiative. They're also pursuing a PhD in sociology with an emphasis in crime. Their dissertation focuses on the criminalization of transgender people through a queer criminological and intersectional lenses. They received their instructor training through the Inside Out Prison Exchange Program, and they are also a longtime volunteer with the Appalachian Prison Book Project. Due to unforeseen circumstances, Rayna will not be able to participate today, but we will be sharing links to their research in the chat, and we can direct any questions to them after the event. Stepping in to support our panel is one of our sponsors, LGBT Books to Prisoners. They are a donation-driven, volunteer-run organization based in Madison, Wisconsin, that sends books and other educational materials free of charge to incarcerated LGBTQ people across the United States. They were created in 2007. They have been doing this work for over 10 years and sent books to over 9,000 people during this time. They have built a large community of volunteers and organizers, and they have been engaged in additional special projects, including the partnership with UW-Madison Archives that houses their archival materials. They are also the recipients of an ARCIS grant that allows them to not only purchase, but continue distribute $5,000 of books by and for trans women of color. It is this necessary and powerful work that they will be speaking on this evening. We're fortunate to have a distinguished panel with us tonight, and we look forward to a great discussion around reimagining justice for system-impacted gender and sexual minorities. To the attendees of this evening event, as you listen to panelists, please remember to use the Q&A tool to submit any questions you have so the panelists will be able to respond to them, and we will begin the event with Valena.
Thank you, Danielle. And I definitely want to say from the get-go, we really want to hear your questions and concerns. So please do use the Q&A. And Rayna is with us with spotty internet, but she may be able to answer questions. So please go ahead and put your questions for them as well in the Q&A, please. So I'm Valena Beety. I'm going to show a couple of slides, but I'm really just excited to be here. Oh, and I want to show I have my Books Are Magic shirt on as well, and that's both a store and I think a great motto, and the books really do so much for all of us. All right, so great. So I've written this book called Manifesting Justice, Wrongly Convicted Women Reclaim Their Rights. And that's an image of the cover right there. I lived in Morgantown for 7 years. I moved to Morgantown to found the West Virginia Innocence Project. And I was thankful to work with so many people at WVU, like Katie Ryan, like APBP, to really do outreach and support incarcerated people in whatever way we could. And tremendous applause to Katie Ryan and the many people who have worked with her to create the WVU Higher Education in Prison Initiative to be able to provide courses to incarcerated people for credit. And also to all of the people at WVU who have done Inside Out classes as well. I'm now at Arizona State, but I have a very big part of my heart for West Virginia, for being there. So I wrote this book, Manifesting Justice, because I wanted to share stories about people in the LGBTQ community, queer women who have been wrongfully convicted. That is my field. I know it's a narrow slice of the pie, but that's the work that I've been doing in my career. So I was a rape victim advocate in college, And that led me to want to become a prosecutor because I thought that by incarcerating someone who had committed an act of violence, that would somehow stop violence. So I was what would be called a carceral feminist. I no longer am. That was a transformational experience for me to be on that side and realize it's a failing system. So I became an innocence litigator, which means I have represented people who have been wrongfully convicted. I do have a broad scope for what that necessarily means, but that has been the majority of my own litigation work. And then I identify as a queer woman. I'm married to an amazing woman, Jennifer Oliva. So this is part of my story as well. And the main focus of the book, Manifesting Justice, is two of my clients, Lee Stubbs and Tammy Vance. And this is actually, Lee was my client, Tammy is her co-defendant. And this is the happy ending. This is the day when the two of them were released from prison and their convictions were reversed. But they had served 10 years in prison, not just for a crime they didn't commit, but for a crime that didn't necessarily even occur. And the story is really about three women in Mississippi who go to a drug treatment program in rural Mississippi. And at that place, two of these women meet and fall in love, Lee and Tammy. And they finish the program and they're about to leave, and their friend Kim asks if she can come with them. So they take Kim with them, and in less than 48 hours, Kim has overdosed on Oxycontin and alcohol. So they frantically, they see their friend overdosing, they call 911, an ambulance comes, takes Kim to the hospital. And at the hospital, she's in a coma, but the emergency room doctor thinks that he sees signs of an aggressive sexual encounter that he would describe as a sexual assault. He sees paddle marks across her back and then some redness in her vagina. And that's where this becomes very weird. So a dentist, Michael West, comes in to examine Kim's body. I mean, you can't even make this up, right? So a dentist comes in, has full access to her naked body, and he alleges that he finds bite marks. And not only does he find bite marks, he says that half of Kim's labia has been bitten off, gone, bitten off. Like, there's no evidence to substantiate this besides him saying it, but that's his allegation. And this becomes criminal charges against Lee and Tammy, because who would chew off and bite off this woman's labia except for two lesbians who were with her? So that's how this whole cycle starts. So Lee and Tammy were wrongfully convicted based on faulty forensic evidence, bite mark evidence, which is largely bogus and unreliable. Happy to talk about that, but don't trust bite marks, and homophobic testimony. So I'm going to, don't want to go too far over on my time, but I'm going to give you some examples from the book of the testimony that was used against them, and that I worry about this moment we're in right now, where there's really inflamed, emotional, false narratives that are going on against trans individuals, against queer individuals, and behind this legislation that is happening to recriminalize our identities. So I just want to give a bit of an example of some of the things that were said about the two of them, and were provided as evidence to a jury. So the expert testimony, and who's our expert? Our expert is the dentist. So the expert testimony was, here's some of it, in a homosexual rape case, which is what they started calling this. You would expect to find bite marks, would not be unusual. No, it wouldn't be unusual. In fact, it would be almost expected that you'd find bite marks. And all of this is just tying it back to Lee and Tammy because of their sexuality, almost. And then when he claimed that part of Kim's labia had been bitten off, he called that usually a combative or a sexual orientation phenomenon. So that's the state's evidence. And then sadly, the defense evidence, so the defense expert for Lee and Tammy was asked, would you expect to find biting? Would that be consistent with a lesbian rape? Yes, homosexual crimes are very sadistic. The more violent crimes I've seen in my experience are homosexual to homosexual. They do overkill. They do tremendous damage. They're more gory. The more repulsive crimes I've ever seen were homosexual to homosexual. So based on those two experts, the prosecutor was able to say, you know, these bite marks indicate this is a homosexual assault. And all of this just goes back to these tropes that we've seen for decades about queer people being violent, depraved, degenerate, vicious, dangerous, all of those stereotypes melding together. And again, this was provided as evidence against these two women. So Lee and Tammy, thankfully, their convictions were reversed, but they're not the only ones. I wanted to give an example of the San Antonio Four, who 3 of them are Latina and they are lesbians in Texas who were wrongfully convicted for a crime that didn't occur. Their charges were part of the satanic abuse charges. And during the satanic panic in the 1980s and early 90s, around, you know, were daycare providers or caretakers harming little kids in fantastical ways, like taking them out on a ship and watching, you know, someone throw a baby to a shark, like really, really fantastical things that did not happen. A lot of that was geared against gay men and against women. All right, so I did want to share, this is a survey that I got from Ethan Rice at Lambda Legal. They did this survey in 2012 because it's not just wrongfully convicted people, and it's really about how queer people in general are treated disparately within the court system and how they're talked about. So this survey was about negative comments about sexual orientation, gender identity, expression. And you see how many of those people who experience this are low income, are people of color, are transgender, gender nonconforming, 53% transgender, gender nonconforming people of color, 66% trans women of all races and ethnicities. Again, hearing jokes, feeling threatened, or forced to be open for reasons not related to the case. So this is a much, much broader problem. And then I'm sure, as we'll talk about tonight, transgender people, and particularly transgender people of color, are also harassed by law enforcement. So there's the problems with law enforcement, there's the problems in the courtroom, and then there's the problems in incarceration. So it's throughout the entire process. And I just want to close. So that survey that you saw with the results from Lambda Legal, it's 10 years later. They're doing a new survey right now. It's at protectedandserved.org. Richard Science is the guy who's really leading this. And it's trying to collect information on people in the LGBTQ+ community and their experiences with police violence, but also with incarceration and with the court system. So I really encourage you to fill out this survey if you have experience and insights to share. So I think that's a crucial way for us to, again, know what's going on. So thank you, everyone. That's just an overview of my book.
Thank you, Valena. As Valena was talking in the chat, I put ways in which you can follow Valena's work, also how you can purchase her book. Then I also did go ahead and provide the link. And while our panelists are talking tonight, I will be sure to keep putting, links in the chat. You can also go ahead and, just as a reminder, use that Q&A tool down at the bottom. And so Hugh will go next.
Thank you so much, Danielle. And thank you, Valena. And thank you to everyone for coming out tonight. I think that it is incredible fortitude to submit to another Zoom meeting at the end of your day. And so that shows just real care. And yeah, I want to say thank you. My book is called The Women's House of Detention. It came out earlier this year, and it is about a prison that was located, it was actually a jail and prison, in the heart of Greenwich Village from 1929 to 1974, which is called The Women's House of Detention. I have very little imagination. I'm going to give a little PowerPoint presentation right now just to orient everyone to the House of D, as it was called. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the themes of the book. So this is the Women's House of Detention, this big 12-story building here. This thing with the courthouse, or with the clock tower next to it, was the courthouse. Today, that's the Jefferson Market Garden and Library in Greenwich Village. If you're not familiar with the geography of Manhattan, here's Greenwich Village. And right sort of where I tried to make that arrow would be about where the House of D was, at the intersection of 6th Avenue, 10th Street, Greenwich Avenue, and Christopher Street. One of the things that I discovered in doing this research that surprised a lot of people, including myself, is that the Stonewall Inn, where the Stonewall Uprising began, was just 500 feet from the prison. And if we want to talk about this, the folks who were incarcerated there on the nights of the Stonewall Uprising actually participated in a riot all their own. But that's a detail. This is the entrance here, 10 Greenwich Avenue, which has had detention centers and facilities of some kind before the Women's House Detention for 150 years. In fact, there is almost no time in which Greenwich Village existed that it did not have some kind of detention facility in it, dating back to the 1790s. Here's just one more little image. This is a map that was produced for tourists. You can see that the House of D is in this purple spot. It's big, it's raised. It was seen as a landmark of the neighborhood for both residents and for folks who were coming to visit. This is what it looked like on the inside. This is a photo of 6 women who are all trying to kick heroin, which was taken probably sometime in the mid 1950s. I don't use a lot of photos from the prison. They're produced in, carceral, controlling, coerced ways, and they often veer into trauma porn, but I think it is important to get at least one sense of what it was like inside. And then this is the cover of my book, and I'm going to stop the sharing there. So there's a lot to this book, way more than I understood that I was getting into when I started. I started writing this book because when I wrote my previous book, which was called When Brooklyn Was Queer, a number of the folks that I followed over the course of that book ended up passing through the House of Detention or the Women's Court at some point during their lives. Women, non-binary folks, trans men, I found all of them incarcerated at the House of D. And that put it on my radar. I started thinking about prisons as places that produce data that was useful for myself as a queer historian. I didn't come to this as a prison historian, nor even as an abolitionist. I was a progressive who thought prisons needed to be reformed. When I started to do this research, I began to realize that I didn't know what the prison system was doing, and that its connections with queer history go far beyond simply documenting information, that the Women's House of Detention specifically, and prisons generally, have had incredible effects on queer life, queer culture, queer neighborhoods, and of course, queer people. But when I decided to write the book, what actually made me do it was a single statistic that I came across from the Williams Institute at UCLA, which said that 40% of people currently incarcerated in women's prisons, 40% identify somewhere on the LGBTQ spectrum. And that was in interviews done in prison. So people had to verbally acknowledge themselves as a, quote, sexual minority to be counted that way. And I was just shocked. Now I had 2 pieces of what felt like really critical information that I couldn't kind of put together with my understanding of queer history and the queer world. A women's prison in the heart of Greenwich Village for 50 years, over the period where it becomes a tourist destination and the center of kind of queerness in America. During the period in which Greenwich Village defines what it means to be queer for America, there is this women's prison located at the heart of it. And then combine that with the fact that today 40%, that there is a crisis of incarceration among queer women, trans men, and non-binary folks who are assigned female at birth, that we are almost never talking about in mainstream queer organizations, in queer history. All of this told me that there was something here that I really needed to dig into. And luckily, I happened to know someone, an activist and a speaker and just an all-around phenomenal human being who I imagine some of you may have met, named Jay Toole, who had been incarcerated in the House of D and who led walking tours of the neighborhood to tell people about it. So she brought me along and told me about her experiences, and I began doing this research. And what I quickly realized is that there was way more here than I could understand in just looking at the prison. So the book actually has to go back all the way until the Civil War, because the origins of the system of what we call women's justice is really a post-Civil War phenomenon that took what had been up until that point a system primarily designed to punish the antisocial, usually violent acts of white men, and redesigned it to be a force of social control for women of all races and Black people of all genders, both of whom were newly entering the public sphere on larger and larger numbers post-Civil War. For women, part of what this meant was that prior to this point, the government saw most of the kind of control, punishment, containment, and forced feminization of people assigned female at birth to be the priority of their families, either their birth families, if they were white and still lived with them, usually American born, their birth families and the families that enslaved them, if they were born into enslavement, usually Black and American born, or their families of origin and the families that employed them if they were domestic workers, which were a mix, but in New York during the period I was looking at, largely white, foreign born. The family was supposed to control these people. And as they moved into the public sphere post-Civil War, the American government realized someone else was going to need to do that work. And they took the prison system and they used that to control women. Largely, it becomes a forced feminization process. The first detention center to open up strictly for women in America opens in the 1870s. And in their annual report, they kind of put into words what will motivate women's incarceration for decades, centuries to come, that their job was to, quote, retrain and remold women so that they will take on the roles God has assigned them: wives, mothers, and educators of children, right? And by educators of children, they don't necessarily mean teachers, they mean people who raise kids. All of those jobs in the eyes of the government required being properly feminine. And so if that was all that you could do, that's what the prison system needed to do, to make people properly feminine so they could have the proper kinds of jobs so that they would not end up back in prison. And so we developed an entire system of forced feminization that obviously focuses from the very beginning, even before they have the kind of words we have today to talk about it, on queer women, trans men, and non-binary folks. So that's the very long history that comes before we even get to the opening of the prison in 1932. And from there, the rest of the book really is an examination of the lives, stories, and experiences of these women, trans men, and non-binary folks, as close as I could get in documentation to their own words, their own thoughts. I follow their ideas in order to understand what the prison was doing. And they're the ones who led me to abolition, to seeing that if this system cannot be fixed, and in fact, no one seems to be interested in fixing it, that perhaps it is not even doing what I understood. One of the last people to be incarcerated in the House of D was Angela Davis. And so her work became critically important to my work. That's the big picture of the Women's House of Detention. I'm happy when we get into the Q&A to discuss any of those parts, or if there are other more pertinent parts to the actual experiences of the folks in the prison, happy to discuss that too. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Hugh, for sharing that. And now we are going to have LGBT Books to Prisoners come on. They are doing a training right now, so we are so grateful and thankful that they were able to go ahead and give us some time to share with us what their project is about, and then also go ahead and answer any questions you have about their organization. So I believe they're coming on now.
Yes, hello. Could not figure out how to turn on my camera, so you'll just have to imagine us. So we are LGBT Books Prisoners. I am Nicholas, one of the organizers. Yeah, it slides back and forth, but either directions it's black. We are a collaborative group, and we're collaboratively not figuring out the camera. So who we are is a prison abolitionist organization, which is a little bit maybe distinct from a prison support organization, but can get into that more if you want. And before COVID, we were sending 3,000 packages a year to around 400 prisons, and that would usually be about, we do max of 2 packages per person, and so I guess between 1,500 and probably 2,000 people would be getting a package from us each year. We have 12,000 people in our database, and as I think you've heard, we've been working for about 10 years. Now we are slowed down a bit, and so we've done just 542 packages in 2022. And we are doing just 1 book per person that requests per year. And that's sort of just a limitation of our time, our organizing capacity, and the number of people that are asking for books. We serve primarily LGBT prisoners. We do share the space with Wisconsin Books to Prisoners, who serves prisoners from Wisconsin. And we ship to, what is it? All of the states except for Texas. And similar to the restriction of 1 book per person per year, 1 package per person per year, thank you, Nick, is that it's a limitation of our time. And then also, as a lot of you probably know, Texas's restrictions on prisoners' lives are pretty onerous. I remember when I worked at NYC Books to Prisoners, there was like a list of topics and books that you could and couldn't send. And one of the restrictive topics was homosexuality. And so it makes it hard to send books to queer people if they're asking about homosexuality. That is about what we are. We can talk a little bit about our challenges and such, but I'll send it back to the panelists and look at the chat and or the Q&A.
Okay, give me just a second to pull up this. Okay, so we do have a couple questions in the chat, but I thought maybe before we answer those really quick, I just wanted to go ahead and offer any of the panelists an opportunity to respond to something they might have thought. I know how hard it is whenever you're participating in an event to also go ahead and jot down, those notes. And so if you just, had something off the top of your head real quick, and then we'll go ahead and start with that first question in the chat if there's nothing else that wants to be said.
Yeah, actually, really quickly, I would love, Valena, I also worked as a rape crisis hotline volunteer for a couple of years, actually, and had some real eye-opening experiences. So I was just wondering if there were anything that you could share from that experience and how it changed your thinking.
Sure. So I was an advocate in Chicago, and I was on call for, I think it was 16 hospitals that I had. I had a pager, but I had a pager. And if there was someone who had experienced sexual assault and came to an emergency room, I would be on call to go to the emergency room. And really, I was there to be the advocate for that individual vis-a-vis the police who were coming in, how the doctors and nurses were engaging with that person. Now we have so many more sane nurses who are, and that's a term, S-A-N-E, who are trained, frankly, on how to work with survivors. But you can imagine being re-traumatized in that experience of going to the hospital and having this really traumatic moment for you, and then a police officer coming in and interrogating you in that moment. So for me, I thought it was really important. But I also, I mean, Hugh, I got this thing in my head that we should be stopping people who are perpetrating violence. And if it's the same person who can harm multiple people, won't it help more people if we stop that person? And in my mind, that transformed into, and we had a culture to support this, incarcerate those people, right? If I become a prosecutor and I incarcerate the person who allegedly committed an act of violence, then that's going to stop the cycle of violence. And it was through doing that job. I mean, I got my dream job. It was through doing that job that I realized it doesn't. It really, two things. One, those prosecutions are difficult to obtain. So often it's a plea for a lower offense. So what is 6 months in prison going to do for the survivor, the community, the individual? What is that going to do? Nothing. And so frequently that was the response. So how much were we doing for survivors? And then I ended up being a quite coercive prosecutor who would have survivors arrested so that they would show up in court to testify. So it's really not necessarily set up to protect survivors, but I'm giving you such a long answer. I'm almost done. But on the other side, what were we possibly doing to stop violence through incarcerating these people? I mean, prison is criminogenic. It does not get at the root causes of violent behavior or violent actions. And it definitely doesn't help someone really dive deep into those root causes and try to change their own behavior. And people who are changing their own behavior in prison, it's in spite of prison. So any I'll just say propaganda that's out there that, oh, you know, if you go to prison, then you can take classes, which you often can't. Oh, you'll be able to work on anger management. No. Oh, you'll be able to be dry and sober. No. So all of these things, prison actually wasn't stopping these cycles of violence at all. What about you? Did your experience? Like, do you think about that experience in relation to writing The House of D?
Yeah, absolutely. One in particular that stuck with me ever since. I think we were probably doing this around the same time, since I also had a beeper and got my first cell phone to do this. It was like the late 90s, early 2000s. We would take overnight shifts, and I was so paranoid about them that I got a cell phone because I couldn't even sleep when I had the overnight shifts. But there was this was in Ithaca, which is a very progressive town in upstate New York. And it's where I had gone to school, and the calls were all over the place, lots of different kinds of calls, but we did police advocacy as well as hospital advocacy, depending on what people wanted from us. And one of the things they told us at the very beginning was that, you know, the police in Ithaca relatively were pretty good. You know, they were like, that's not going to do anything though. They were like, we want you to understand, these are far from the worst. It's not going to help. And so I didn't know what that meant. You know, I just didn't have the necessary experience. And I got a call at one point, maybe a year into doing it. And it was from the friend of a young woman who had been sexually assaulted. And she had gone to the police to find out what her options were. She didn't want to make a formal claim or report at that point. And a few days later, the cops had shown up at her job and they nearly got her fired, demanding that she come down and make a statement because they thought they could catch this guy, right? Like they thought they knew who it was, even though she had not given them any information, and she in fact was not sure she wanted to go forward with this. She had to sort of come out about what had happened to her job in order to keep her waitressing gig. They took her from it, brought her down to the station where they had been grilling her for hours, trying to get her to agree. Like in their heads, they were helping, right? They were like, we're going to prosecute. And they hadn't let her get in touch with anyone. Her friend had seen what had happened. So her friend had contacted us. We went down there. Then they tried to stop us from talking to her. And the whole time through, and what has stuck with me ever since was them explaining that these were actually some of the better police. And truly, from the perspective of the officer we were working with, what he was doing was the thing that would help her the most. And I was like, oh, this is an entire systemic failure, right? Like I wasn't yet connecting it to prisons. I didn't have a larger language. I was doing a lot of sexual violence work, anti-sexual violence work. And I could see that this was just like something was terribly wrong, and that stuck with me forever.
Yeah, thank you both for sharing that. I feel like as a sexual assault advocate myself, like we all didn't know that we were all sexual assault advocates, but we were. I feel like I had a similar experience, and I definitely feel like it's shaped the way that I do so much of the work that I do. But so let's get started with some of these questions. I'm so glad that we have some. And so our first one is from Jennifer. I'm just going to go ahead and use people's first names. And Jennifer asked, I believe this one is going to be most to Valena. Can you explain the legal process of getting these bogus convictions overturned? How long does it take? And what was the standard / what did you have to prove? How long were Leah and Tammy wrongfully incarcerated?
Thank you. So the key takeaway here is that it is incredibly, incredibly difficult to reverse a conviction. Once a judge or a jury has convicted someone, and then the appellate court says, yep, nothing went wrong at the trial, it is so hard to reverse that conviction because our system is invested in finality. And that also plays into how people are treated when they're incarcerated, because it does turn into, no, we've already decided this about this person. We no longer care what happens with this person. We just need them separated out and put in a prison. So it's really this very damaging story of finality that our system is super, super invested in. So once you're convicted, you've been judged. You've been determined to have, committed an offense against society. So for the two of them, we really needed evidence to show that they were wrongfully convicted. And that standard really is for factual innocence, to be able to prove like you're factually innocent. And in a case without DNA evidence, that's really hard to prove. And that's most women who are wrongfully convicted don't have DNA in their cases. And I'll just point out 70% of women exonerees were convicted where no crime occurred. So like Leah and Tammy, like the San Antonio Four, no crime occurred and they were wrongfully convicted. And then finally, so the standard is actual innocence, but I argue in the book that it should be about whether this is a manifest injustice or miscarriage of justice. So instead of saying, has this person proven their innocence, say, do we really trust this conviction? Do we want to uphold this conviction? If we know a police officer lied on a stand, do we want to uphold the conviction? If we know prosecutors didn't turn over evidence, do we want to uphold it? The focus should be on that and on the problems in the system rather than, has this person satisfied us enough to prove this high level of innocence? And they served 10 years in prison.
Thank you so much for that. This next one is going to be for Hugh. And so Jennifer wants to know, what were the typical sorts of charges that the individuals incarcerated at the House of D face, and what sorts of sentences were they forced to serve?
They were all over the place, but there are three sets of charges in particular that I want to pull out because they're predominant, and I think they're very instructive about what was happening there. The first one is in the earliest period of the prison, and before the prison opened, in the early 1900s, far and away the most common charge was a kind of prostitution called vagrancy prostitution. Vagrancy prostitution, in the eyes of New York City law, did not actually require the exchange of sex for money, nor did it require evidence. It was a crime that men, by law, could not be charged with. And in fact, that the men involved could not be found guilty in any way, because what the kind of precedent had determined was that vagrancy prostitution is simply the common lewdness of woman. The idea was any poor woman was an invitation to prostitution. And so if you're arresting a woman for anything that's kind of in the nimbus of poverty, they are obviously going to become a prostitute at some point. And so you'll just arrest them as a prostitute now and get it over with. This is far and away the vast majority of women who are arrested in the early years of the prison are arrested on these sex work charges. Additionally, and on top of that, we have something that starts in World War I called the American Plan. The American Plan is rarely talked about today, but it was a sort of war readiness program that every attorney general in the country, every prison and every detention center in the country were brought into. And the idea was this: during World War I, sailors, soldiers, other military men were needed for the fight. And so to protect them, we needed to round up any woman who might have a venereal disease, which is, of course, any woman who is a prostitute, which is any woman who is poor. And so the government spent decades pulling all of these women into prisons and detention hospitals, sometimes with charges, often without any charge whatsoever. And you were kept incarcerated until you were found to be negative for syphilis and gonorrhea. Unfortunately, before World War II, neither the tests nor the cures were any good. Frequently, these people were pumped full of arsenic and mercury, these toxic compounds that could themselves kill you, with the hope being that it would kill the bacteria before it killed the woman. So we have these disorderly conduct, or these vagrancy prostitution arrests that are happening. Then we have a level of women who are being arrested for being prostitutes, except they're not being arrested, they're not prostitutes, and they may or may not have a venereal disease, which the government doesn't even really care that much about curing. They just want to keep them away from men. A lot of what we see in the earliest part, and I would argue still today, in women's detention and incarceration, is about protecting white men and the white family and the imagined white child, right? So we see this throughout the history of the prison, but particularly in the earlier years. And the last crime that we see a lot of that I want to pull out is drug use. All kinds of different crimes of drug use. These really, however, become an issue post-World War II, because one of the things I found out in doing this book is that our approach to drugs vastly, radically shifts over the first part of the 20th century. We used to have what was called a regulatory regime, which is a lot more like how we handle cigarettes, right? A tax on it that's not meant to raise any money, but is just make you less likely to do that action. Over the course of about 20 years, all of these folks who had used drugs when they were legal in these ways, when cocaine was in Coca-Cola, when pharmacists sold edibles for menstrual cramps, when the most common opioid user was a rich white society lady who had a laudanum locket, right? That was the idea of drugs in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And we have to create a whole new regime, a whole new understanding of what drugs are, a whole new set of laws in order to incarcerate increasingly, almost exclusively, at least in the New York example, Black women and other women of color who are coded as Black by the system, because the system does a really bad job always with all information about incarcerated folks, but particularly around race, it's really bad. Of course, men of color were also being arrested for drug charges, but I think that those are kind of really, they tell us a lot about what was happening in the prison. Now, in my research, I also found women arrested for every other kind of thing you can imagine. I found women who were arrested for being alone on the street at night. I found women who were arrested for murder. I found trans men who were arrested for wearing pants. I found people who were arrested for sending the definition of the word lesbian through the mail to their girlfriend. You know, it's like all over the place. But those couple of charges, the drug use, sex work, and venereal disease, are really three of the prime movers.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for that, Hugh. And so, Valena, I see that you already did answer this this one.
Sorry, I meant to like just type an answer. I didn't know that that would.
Yeah, it shifts it, but it's okay. So, so Natalie went ahead and asked, Natalie said, I'm teaching a high school level prison narratives course this fall to honor seniors at a pretty progressive school in Tampa Bay. How would you suggest introducing this material in a digestible way for students who are new to this material? I'm always leaning on statistics, and I have a whole unit on PIC as neo-slavery, but any pointers would be helpful. And I think also, so Valena did go ahead and suggest ear hustle. You can elaborate a little bit more on that, but I also wanted to open it to Hugh. You can talk about it. Katie, if you wanted to come off mic, because I know that you also teach class, or LGBT books to prisoners. I don't know if you have any of your people there who are also instructors, but feel free to jump on and answer that as well. And then I can talk a little bit about how I incorporate this subject matter into my classes as well.
Well, I do a little work with high school students, not a ton, but one of the things that I have found to be very fruitful in discussing these issues with every age group that are new to them is kind of walking through a very hypothetical but also very real scenario, which is to ask them, how many people do you know who have committed something that we might call a crime and never been arrested for it? And never gone to jail for it. And let's imagine how many people in the room that's true for, right? And how that already begins to start to tell us certain people are arrested for crimes and certain people aren't. And then let's take that imagined example a little bit further. Say, for instance, one of the things, because my book does focus on women and assigned female at birth people, one of the things that frequently happens today and historically is that you may find a young person who is masculine of center, who does not want to wear the uniform of the school that they have to go to because it involves skirts. So they start getting written up for violating school policy, which eventually perhaps leads to truancy, which leads to a charge of waywardism, which eventually gets them involved in the juvenile system. The recidivism rates for folks involved in the juvenile system, and once the system has its claws into you, it's never going to try to let you go. And so then suddenly you're getting incarcerated for more and more serious charges. People are watching you. You're being unable to get the education that you couldn't get simply because you wanted to wear pants, right? And these things compound upon themselves. So I find it helps folks who maybe haven't thought a lot about how one ends up in prison to walk through this scenario that brings them from a place of understanding, like, oh, those are things that I do and people that I know do and have been entirely free and gotten away. And they think at first, oh, well, it would just be a slap on the wrist, right? Nothing really bad's going to happen because of this minor crime of like one time I drove under the influence, or I sped, or I this, or I that. But we see all the time how, particularly these days, Black people are murdered by the cops in speed traps, So I think working them through those steps has been very helpful for me.
Katie, I think we'd love to hear from you if you're
Hey,
on.
yeah, I'm
great.
happy to jump in. Nat is actually a former student of mine who asked this question, so I know that Nat knows my answer to this. But yeah, I would affirm everything that Hugh just said about breaking it down and making it personal. I teach American literature. I teach prison studies at West Virginia University, and I teach a lot of classes that showcase autobiographies by incarcerated or formerly incarcerated people. And it is extraordinary, the impact of those narratives, including Angela Davis's, of course, classic autobiography and Malcolm X, but many others, you know, I think that's one of the things, actually, Nat, that you ended up writing your final paper on in our class was about women's autobiographies globally, right? Women who've been in confinement. I would recommend, and I didn't use this in my class, Nat, but James Kilgore's book, Understanding Mass Incarceration, because it's really geared toward like an introduction to the prison industrial complex. Just Mercy, of course, has been, you know, I think incredibly moving. It has moved sort of the conversation. And then 10 years before that, like Michelle Alexander's new Jim Crow, of course. So, you know, so my strategy is to sort of steep, you know, ourselves in narratives and history. I, you know, also, as Hugh mentioned, start a lot of my classes with the Civil War and what happened, you know, post-war. With regard to prisons. And I've done some work in the archives in West Virginia on the West Virginia State Penitentiary. So I sort of work that in because that can sort of connect to students, like they kind of know that prison, it's in Moundsville. And I have a question that I wasn't able to ask because I think as a sort of tech person, I'm unable to ask a question in the Q&A. So I might pivot and ask this question, but I don't want to you know, bypass Natalie's question about teaching this to high school students. I actually think also, you know, we do this till we free us. Miriam Kaba's book would be really effective because she spent so much of her time thinking about, you know, young people and advocacy. But I did have, but so let me, before I ask my question, I'll come back to that. I think Danielle, you also had some thoughts about teaching.
Yeah, so for my class, I know it's not high schoolers, but I have an introduction to criminology class. And I've been doing the same thing for a couple years now where I do similar things where, like Katie, I like to incorporate like narratives and things like that. So actually 1 week when we're talking about victimology, I have them read the introduction, and I believe it's chapter 1 or chapter 2 of Danielle Sered's book, Until We Reckon. And then I go ahead and I have them, like, I prompt them with different discussion questions, or I ask them, like, how did you feel like learning about this, and how, you know, survivors are saying that, like, actually what I need is not the criminal legal system, and I need someone to like listen to me, and like my needs might be, I need someone to move me out of this apartment, or I need someone to get me groceries, or I need to just literally get a sexual assault exam so I can get medicine. And so I think that like those sorts of things are easy to do and like and to prompt students with. And I also kind of use Ear Hustle or different podcasts in the same way. And then also to plug Valena's book. Valena actually has discussion questions at the end of her book. And so I've been talking with Valena about how I'm actually going to go ahead and use a couple different chapters and then use the specific discussion questions to kind of like start the conversation with them. And then they can go ahead and talk about like their experiences, or like how, you know, stereotypes or how their myths were busted by like reading this information that may have been the first time that they're actually reading it.
Thank you, Danielle. And if I could just jump in for one more thing. Katie made the great point about post-Civil War incarceration, what was called convict leasing. And there's a really powerful book called Worse Than Slavery about Parchman Farm in Mississippi. But it does have a section that's about Florida and the swamps in Florida being dredged and cleared, which I maybe applies also to the area around Tampa, largely by incarcerated people. And that included both Native people as well as Black people. And it was a frequently a setup, and the book is by a historian who's amazing, but frequently a setup by the local sheriff who would get some kind of kickback. And so he would arrest, a strong young Black man on a trumped up charge. Then that person gets years of a sentence and is working to clear those swamps. And there is a high death rate of doing that work. So that's specific to Florida.
And I'll just add, in addition to worse than slavery, and I think we read this in that class that Nat took at WVU, but Slavery by Another Name by Douglas Blackman. And that's just a phenomenal history of really 100 years of convict leasing and labor, the use of imprisoned people's labor. And there's a PBS documentary that the author was involved in making. So it's a great teaching tool. You can connect the students to the documentary as well. Oh, and I also wanted to say that I often teach Dwayne Betts's book of poems, Felon. And I think that, multimodal is important, like the TED Talks, the podcasts, the autobiographies, and we never want to forget, and the history, right? But also not forgetting poetry and hip hop. I sometimes include hip hop songs, right? But Dwayne Betts's book Felon is phenomenal. And again, you can find a lot of videos of him reading his own work and giving talks. Yeah.
Katie, before you ask your question, can you, Nat wanted to know the book that you had mentioned. Can you, before in your answer before I had talked?
Yeah, I think it was James Kilgore, maybe. Was it that one, Natalie? It's Understanding Mass Incarceration, and the last name is Kilgore, Kilgore. Yeah, I think that would be great for high school and college. Yeah, so my question was about Hugh, and about you mentioned that you felt like the women at the House of D were really leading you, like in sort of this abolitionist path. And I'm just wondering if you could speak a little bit about your archival, experience. I know from doing some of that, it's a challenge to get the voices of the people, right, who are incarcerated, or and certainly to get like their families' experiences. And we're thinking about trying to get folks who maybe who aren't proximate to incarceration to understand it better. The family experience is also so critical. So I'm just wondering, what primary sources you were able to find.
Yeah, that was actually the central first question for the first year of my work on this book was, am I going to be able to find the sources to tell this story in a way that is valid? I mean, prisons produce a lot of data, but that's not good information, nor is it any, you can't trust it, and you can't build a narrative around it, right? Because it only sees a person through the lens of the problem that they represent to the prison. And so I tried looking, I thought, maybe in early LGBT groups like the Mattachine Society and the Daughters of Bilitis, maybe their files, I'd find some stuff. I didn't really find anything. And then I tried early LGBTQ periodicals, mentions occasionally, but in both of those sources, if they talked about issues of incarceration, it was almost exclusively around men and trans women who had been arrested for specifically gay crimes, soliciting and cross-dressing. And that was about it. Certainly not very much at all about the Women's House of Detention, incarcerated queer women and trans men, or what I was seeing a lot of, which was people who were queer and whose queerness definitely seemed to lead into their incarceration. They were not being arrested for specifically gay crimes. So I actually spent a long period of time sitting with other historians who work in marginalized communities and looking at the ways that they did their research. How did they go back earliest? And the one who really turned out to be incredibly helpful for me was Saadia Hartman, Wayward Lives, Beautiful Experiments. Incredible book. And one of the things she talks about in the introduction, I believe, is this process that she calls critical fabulation, which is the use of the imagination when the archive doesn't exist, right? How do we talk about things that have not been archived? And the way that I used that in my work for this book was to imagine the lives of the incarcerated folks that I wanted to be listening to, who I wanted to learn from, and to think about how they're going to end up in public records, right? Because there are two ways you end up in the public record. Either you have power, so you publish a book, people come and interview you, you own a home in which your diary is kept, and you have descendants who care about you, and so they promote your diary in the world, yada, yada. All these ways you enter on your own terms. Most of the folks I was researching, that was not how they entered public records. Instead, they entered as the raw material for someone else's entry into the public record. Prisons, obviously, are a major one for these folks. But like I said, the data wasn't good. So where else? Who else would have been capturing in the moment of these people's experiences, their words, their thoughts, and other documents? And I hit on, because I had previously been one, social workers, right? Social workers produce reams of data. Now, it's still coercive, right? This is not a neutral categorizing, but no archive ever is, right? I think sometimes we imagine that there is this like neutral archive where the information that flows out of it is perfect and undisturbed by bias, and that doesn't exist. The great thing about social workers in this instance is that they produced a ton of information, and their biases were openly recorded because they saw their biases as instructional to what they were doing, right? They openly said, oh, we really want fewer masculine women. We want fewer older women. So I was able to account for this a little bit. But I found an organization called the Women's Prison Association, who are still around today. They're the oldest freestanding organization working with formerly incarcerated women. And they had 140 boxes of case files at the New York Public Library that no one had ever looked at. And when I asked for permission to see them, they said, yeah, totally, go for it. Absolutely. They were great. But we don't think you're going to find anything about queer people in them. We just don't think in the 30s and 40s we were talking about those issues. And I said, you might be right, but let me just go look. And within 2 hours of opening the first box, I had found a file that was like over 200 pages and followed this young queer woman's life from her first arrest in 1934 up until death in the 1960s. It was like this incredible amount of information, because it not only had the social worker files, but it had every single doctor's document that had ever been written about this woman that I could find. It had newspaper clippings from when she was interviewed. It had love letters that she had written to her girlfriend in prison. It had letters she wrote to her social worker explaining why she'd run away from home. It had high school transcripts. It had cards that she had drawn. What they captured in these files was incredible, unparalleled, unlike anything else I was ever able to find for this book or any other book I've written. And there were 140 boxes like that. It gets worse as time goes on, right? When you get into the 50s and 60s, we get this real homophobic moment in America, and a lot of the files start to say things like, is a lesbian not appropriate for services? And they close them. But in the earlier part, those files were incredible. And I highly recommend looking into the files of older social work organizations if you're trying to do this kind of research. In the later years, thankfully, I was able to find a number of folks who had been incarcerated, or like you said, who were families or loved ones of folks who had been incarcerated, and I was able to interview them. That is always a very slow process for me. I find my interviewees in a very organic way. I like to be introduced to them by other folks I've interviewed so that the people know that they have someone they can talk to about me. They can ask questions. They can get a sense of what the interview will be like. They can know what to trust me with and how much, and have other people they can talk to afterwards. So my finding of people to interview went sort of very slowly and sideways. Someone would tell me to interview someone else. I would talk to that person. I would talk to her daughter. She would connect me to her mother. So there was much less of that, but that's really what I used for the 60s and into 1970 and 71 when the prison closed. But predominantly, the main bulk of the early part of the book are these old social work files.
That's beautiful. Well, we don't have any more questions yet in the chat, but I had a question that I wanted to ask. This is really for anyone who wants to go ahead and, take a stab at this. I would love it if everyone would just kind of, take a few minutes. But really, conversations that are always talking about like reimagining justice, at least for me, naturally bring up restorative practices, abolition, because of the possibilities in that working to address harm and then also have accountability. And LGBT books to prisoners, I know your organization is very clear that they are a prison abolition project, but I would also love each of you to, take a few minutes to describe how restorative practices and abolition, how they really fit into how you reimagine justice for gender and sexual minorities who are system impacted. And anyone can start first.
Well, I could start. So I have a chapter on this in my book. So I cover a lot of things in the book, and it's just one chapter, but I'm so glad, Danielle, that you mentioned Danielle Served's book, and she founded and leads a restorative justice organization called Common Justice, which really tries to, once someone is arrested for a crime of violence, really tries to take that out of the criminal legal system and find a restorative response to it, where, again, with support, with supportive people there, with a lot of planning, have a true interaction between the survivor and this person who has committed this act of violence, to get at exactly what you're saying, Danielle, some form of internal accountability. Prison does not create accountability at all. It doesn't. It's punitive. It's purely punitive. So again, it's not going to, if someone's behavior has changed, that's because of that individual. It's not because of prison. So Danielle Served's really had success with Common Justice in going this other route of trying to create accountability and also closure for the survivor. And the survivor frequently does not get closure from the criminal legal system, even in very severe cases where, like we'll say a murder case, that's a capital case. So the defendant gets the death penalty. Even after an execution, we see many families that don't feel closure from that. That don't feel like, because it doesn't actually address what's going on. It isn't any sort of accountability. So I think we have to really tackle straight on this fallacy that our criminal legal system puts forward, that, oh, we can solve problems and we produce accountability, because it doesn't.
Yeah, I will say for me, doing this research really did lead me directly to abolition, because abolitionists were the only people who had a sort of structural theory that made sense with what I was seeing. Over and over again, from the year the prisons opened, everyone seems to agree. I mean, everyone, like the New York City mayor, the folks in charge of the prison, the folks who are incarcerated, the police, most of the folks who are there should not be in prison. They will not be helped by prison. They will likely come back to prison soon, and their treatment in the system will be terrible, right? So if everyone agrees about that from the very beginning, over and over again, over and over again, over and over again, we have liberal moments, we have conservative ones, and nothing is capable of changing except more money for bigger prisons, then something isn't adding up, right? If something cannot be fixed, it is not broken. And that was what really abolition drove home to me, that the system actually isn't doing what I think it's doing, and that's why it's unfixable. And once I realized that, it changed everything for me, because then abolition becomes the floor of the demands, right? Not the ceiling, as Mariam Kaba says. This is where we need to start, because the truth is, the system always relapses to cruelty, no matter what kind of reforms we put in, because the nature of the system is not about crime. The nature of the system is that it is a stopgap, a pressure valve for every other system that actually is broken in our country, right? From healthcare to mental health care to education to job training to housing to social safety net. All of those systems of care are broken. And when they do not do their job, there are people who end up uncared for. And in America, we use the prison to treat them, right? That's the only thing the prison is really doing. Sure. It arrests people and deals with crimes. A minor percentage of what it does. Most of what it does is it takes up everything else that we refuse to take care of or fix. So for me, abolition is the floor, but the fixes are upstream, right? We cannot fix the prison system. We have to tear it out by the root and reimagine it. But in order to do that, we need to fix these other systems that actually are broken, that the prison exists as a catch basin for.
Stop. Oh, sorry. That was me telling the tapers to stop. Great job, everyone. I would agree that, and I would say, I'm looking at my notes, system bad. And I think that that is sort of where we're starting from as well, that the prison is not like a solution for acts of violence, it's itself an act of violence. And a big part of that is the way that prison, as well as other system impacting processes, are isolating. And so what we do try to do is form sort of community connection, individual connections with people that we're sending books to. And in the sort of way abolitionist ideas inform that work is, I think we sort of don't really sort of judge people's requests. We try to send as close as possible to the books that they request or the genres that they request. We also don't send to prison libraries, we just send to individuals. And part of that is that the prison library is part of the prison system, and so it's trying to not sort of, you know, make that system better, but sort of just connect with the people who are in prisons. And then another thing that we do is we do try to send notes, sort of again, make that sort of human connection, sort of be that system of care, as well as we have a resource guide of other organizations. So pen pal groups, other prison abolition and groups, lawyer support groups. Those are all things that we don't have time for or energy for, but we do try to connect prisoners with, and all the resources that we can. I think that's about it.
I would try to quickly chime in here as well. I know I've been silent, but in terms of reimagining justice, to me, it's really in part about reimagining what we think about when we think about crime and social control, what comes to mind when we think about who ends up in the system and who doesn't and why, what we want for ourselves and the people in our communities who do find themselves enmeshed in the system. It's very easy to see that prisons are ineffective, but why does mass incarceration exist? Clearly, there is something more to it, and the purpose behind prisons is, pretty evil if you ask me. But abolition just comes very easy to me because I believe that in nearly every single circumstance, there is a better way to respond to what we consider crime than locking people up in cages, locking human beings up in cages, and oftentimes for very long periods of time, oftentimes in complete isolation, oftentimes only to experience significantly more harm than they would if they were in society, in their communities, and given opportunities to really meet their basic needs and be met where they are and be treated with a level of dignity and respect, and understanding that a lot of people, or the majority of people that end up in the system, are from marginalized communities and people that really just have not had full opportunities to really be embraced by society and be able to really have a sense of community and belonging. If people are coming in with social problems cannot be solved by incarceration. I think that that's just one of the easiest arguments. There's just not really evidence to suggest that prisons are effective, yet we use them. We use them in horrible ways. And I think with that, I'll stop.
Well, and Rayna, if you feel comfortable, I wonder if you could, for a minute or two, share your research on transgender individuals who have been incarcerated in West Virginia, in Appalachia, and that particular experience and your research on it.
I don't have a lot that I can share at this time, and a lot of it is really kind of hearsay, in the sense that if you're really looking for numbers out there on how many transgender people are incarcerated, it's those statistics are very hard to come by. I know I recently read a recent report, I believe, by the Prison Policy Initiative that mentioned that roughly 5,000 transgender adults are incarcerated in state prisons. But at the federal level, we don't really have those numbers, yet we know they have to be tracking them considering the fact that there are, is the Prison Rape Elimination Act, and there's a transgender offender manual, and there's policy in place that determines their housing. Up until recently, at least, primarily based on, assigned sex at birth, genitalia, things of that nature. But at one point it was disclosed to me, and I can't, cite anything official, that one of the federal prisons in West Virginia, in particular, that houses people assigned female at birth, has the largest percentage of incarcerated transgender people in the Bureau of Prisons in the nation. I can't tell you whether that is true. That's probably accurate. But what I know is that primarily they're housed not based on their assigned, based on their current gender identity, and that places them in a whole other risk in terms of physical and sexual violence. But I have been speaking with trans people for my dissertation research. I'm not able to really share that information at this time, but I did recently publish a chapter on transgender people in the criminal legal system, where I was really looking at people under probation and parole. And the hardest part there was actually finding official data to confirm how many people come under correctional control in those ways. So a lot of this is the fact that you're finding it's just largely underexplored, underexamined in scholarly research, but it's also something that's kept very hidden, whether it's in the state prison system, the federal prison system, or in our local or regional jails. So finding those numbers is really hard to come by. And that's something that I'm hoping to really kind of do more with, is figure out a way to get a better sense of the numbers. But there have been some, amazing organizations like Black and Pink that are, doing a lot of work and being able to survey people that are incarcerated, and at least hearing more from them and giving them some sort of agency in all of this. So hopefully that helps a little bit. But like I said, I'm not able to share too much. I know they're overrepresented in the criminal punishment system for sure, in terms of both transgender adults and trans youth.
Well, and really, I think that goes back to, not only are prisons horrible at documenting people based on gender identity, but also what Hugh said about race, like documenting race. Prisons, I mean, and we don't want to rely on prisons anyways, as Hugh said, but still trying to get just some broad perspectives on it. If people don't mind, I'm going to go ahead and just share once again this survey that's the Protected and Served. And it is, again, Black and Pink, as well as Lambda Legal, about like trying to find out some of these narratives and experiences. So.
Yeah, thank you so much, Valena, for sharing that. Also in the chat, I did go ahead and share a project that was created by Project NIA and then Interrupting Criminalization. They've created the 1 million experiments. I put the link in the chat so you can explore snapshots of community-based strategies, safety strategies in particular, with this that really emerges from this idea of like believing that like we keep each other safe. And I think that is really important, especially to like use those alternatives. And I did want to really quick, before we kind of, wrap up and let anyone say their, their last thoughts. I did want to give LGBT Books to Prisoner an opportunity to like tell us like how can we go ahead and support you and make sure that the people that you serve are supported, and like are they mentioning specific needs that those who are going to watch this video can go ahead and help you, so you guys have the capacity to help them.
Yeah, I think so. In general, there's like a big thing which I did want to sort of touch on, was a thing that we get hit by and that makes our work harder, is there's increasing restrictions on what books people can get. So nudity, gang content, which often is just code for race content, generally more and more hard to get books to people. So if y'all could work on policies against that, we don't have time to, because it is sort of further imprisoning people are in prison, of restricting their freedom. So good luck with that. And then specifically, you can always check out our book wish list. We are always looking for more trans and bi books if you wanted to support that project. I'm going to link the book wish list. It is Amazon, and that's sort of just because it's easy to find, easy to make a list of books there, so you don't have to buy it off of Amazon. And yeah. Anything else from the group?
There's a number on social media,
Follow us on social media.
and queer folks in prison really need pen pals.
And queer folks in prison really need pen pals. Again, that connection with people is very important.
So Black and Pink.
Black and Pink is the organization to support there, I think, or the clearinghouse. And that's all.
Perfect. Thank you. Well, as we're, getting close to wrapping up, I really did want to give everyone, all the panelists an opportunity. If you had any last minute thoughts or wise words that you wanted to leave us with before I sign us out.
I don't know about wise words, but I did want to say thank you to everyone. This is, a topic that a lot of people don't want to talk about, and there's so much to be done. And so just the fact that y'all are willing to come and do this, here where I am, it's 8:30, and I'm sure for a lot of you, it's dinner time, and you've got a lot of other things pressing on you, and it just means a lot. So I just want to thank everyone for coming.
I also want to thank everyone, and particularly the folks in West Virginia. I miss y'all. So, and if you want, I'm obviously plugging both books, but but if you really want to see how a prison goes through cycles of reform and reform and reform, and it doesn't actually change things, the Women's House of Detention, Hugh's book, it really, it walks you right through that, where you have this one prison and each new generation is like, oh, we're going to reform it in this way and reform it in this way. And it's still the same harmful prison. And on my end, if you are interested in talking about queer women being wrongfully convicted, queer people, or women more broadly, please reach out to me. I'd love to be in touch. So thanks, everyone. And thank you to Appalachian Prison Book Project and LGBT Books to Prisoners. Yeah, thank you for all that you're doing.
Thanks, y'all.
Katie, did you have anything that you wanted to share? Or Rayna?
No, just thanks so much, you all. Your work is so inspiring. It's just phenomenal. And it's great to be connected with LGBT books, our kindred, prison book projects out there. If anyone on the call is local and doesn't know about APBP, please reach out to Danielle or to me or to Rayna. We'd be happy to let you know what we do. But like all prison book projects, we're responding to letters from people in prison who are looking for something to read. So this is another really educational, project and way to understand, right, what's happening. So many students, once they've read some letters, they have really a new take on who's incarcerated. Yeah, let us know if you'd like to get involved with APBP. Danielle, thank you. Such great facilitation tonight. And yeah, just we got to keep doing this work, y'all. There's a lot to be done, but it's a beautiful thing to get together like this. So thank you.
Perfect. So I did want to go ahead and find this quote real quick because I think that it's really relevant. So bear with me 1 second.
And while she's looking that up, there are other prison book projects. So if you aren't local to West Virginia or Appalachia, there's a women's prison book project. So there are other opportunities as well.
Thank you. So I wanted to, before I conclude, I wanted to share this quote from Mark Lamont Hill. And he says, we're dreaming together, envisioning a free and safe world where we can finally turn to each other rather than on each other. And I think that that's just really, really important, especially right now. And so wanted to be respectful of everyone's time, but I did want to go ahead and just say a special thank you to all the panelists for all the important work that they do, which we hope will move the needle on justice for system impacted gender and sexual minorities. I also want to acknowledge the great assistance that we've had from Julie Black and Kayla Stewart at the WU Teaching and Learning Commons for helping us set up this event, because it would not run smoothly if I had to do it all by myself. And really give a great, a special shout out to all of our sponsors, the Appalachian Prison Book Project, the West Virginia Higher Education and Prison Initiative, and then especially LGBT Books to Prisoners, who gave us their time while they were also doing a training. And lastly, thank you to all the attendees who took the time out of your evenings to come to this event and be engaged in the discussion. This, as a reminder, it will be recorded, so you will go ahead and get it once it's captioned and then be able to share it. And we're just so thankful to have you here and to have you in community with us this evening. So thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Good night, everybody.
Thank you.